This video we're going to talk about the security metadata source and how it's used by the voters. Um, Real quick, we'll connect the dots again. So you have your proxy filter, and the proxy filter refers to a list of filter chains. And if we look, for example, on this secure query filter chain, we have a URL pattern that when it matches, that it applies this list of filters. The very last filter is the interceptor filter. The interceptor filter has three objects that are required. It needs a metadata source. The metadata source is injected into the Access Decision Manager. The Access Decision Manager also passes on that metadata source to the voters. So that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at this, this object here, this definition that's the secure query metadata source. And if we go up here, here's its definition. And what we have in here is we have another set of URL mappings, but the special thing about these URL mappings is they also specify the authority, privilege, or role that a user has to have to be able to make this request. And the reason that this works is because the voter checks this. Well, let me just run through this metadata source really quick. So here's a URL pattern. So anything that starts out with secure and then it's followed by query, and it can have anything after that, and then a birth path after that, and then anything after the birth path must have, that user, to be able to make that request, must have an authority that is called query.birth, and this is just a string value. There's no referencing to any other type of object or any special security privileges that are implied here. It's just a string value that has to match what the user has in their authority list. And again, here's an XML example that I use, and that authority matches this authority right here. That's the birth authority. So the metadata source is a way to pass URL mapping with privileges to a voter. That's all it does. So now let's go take a look at the voters and how they use this metadata source. So here is my secure query access interceptor filter that we're using for our example, and it has this decision manager. This decision manager, again, the interceptor filter injects this metadata source into this decision manager, and this decision manager then will pass along that same metadata source to its voters. Now it's up to the voter whether it wants to use that metadata source or not. It's totally up to how that object was coded as to how it reacts. So in this case, our first voter is the authenticated voter. And the authenticated voter, if we scroll up, here's the definition of the authenticated voter. And it is a Spring class, and this Spring authenticated voter object, it actually does use the metadata source, and it looks for specific values within that metadata source. It looks for a value, an authority, or a role privilege that is called is authenticated fully. So when you're going through this metadata source, which is this one in our example, it's going to look at these entries and it's going to say, does the path match this? And if it does, it looks at this value and it says, I don't know anything about that. So I'm going to continue looking on it. It looks at the next one. And it says, this path doesn't match. So I'm going to skip that. Oh, but look at this. This has a path matcher of anything. And yep, my path matches this. And lo and behold, it has a value that I recognize. And it says is authenticated fully. And that actual object, when it sees this value, it goes out to the security context, grabs the user's information, and makes sure that they are fully authenticated. If they're not fully authenticated, that voter will actually deny, it'll vote with a deny value, which then, according to the decision manager, it will use that value to determine if it's going to allow the user to continue to make that request. So that right there is the authentication voter. Let's go look at the next one in the list. So again, I'm going to go back to my Access Decision Manager, and it uses an authorization role voter, and let's go look at its definition. So here's the authentication role voter. This is another Spring class, by definition, if we looked at the code, you would see that it uses the metadata source. And this role voter, it looks for, first of all, it checks the role prefix. There's another video that talks about role prefix and how that works. But this role voter also uses the security metadata source. And what it does is it does the same thing. It does a similar thing that the authentication voter did. It loops through all these entries in the supplied metadata source, and here's the metadata source that it is supplied with. And what it does is it looks at the path, and it says, is the request path, is it matching this path pattern? And if it does, then it looks at the value here, and it tries to match up the authority that the user has with this authority that's specified. So if the path matches, the user has to have this authority, and if it does, it will vote to allow that access. And if it doesn't match this path, then it continues to the next entry. If it matches this one, then they have to have this value. So this role voter is a little bit different in the authentication one, because what it does is it looks for the first one that matches. And if it gets all the way down to the end and it doesn't match anything, then it actually will vote to abstain, and then the decision manager will have to make a determination of whether they're going to allow that through or not. Now, one thing of interest here, the role voter, as it goes through, it has to have something that matches up in here. And because it actually is based on the same code as the authenticated voter, it recognizes this value. So in this instance, it would actually vote to abstain because it doesn't actually have a particular role, but it recognizes this and it sees this pattern of anything. So if it drops out, if the paths don't match, again, if the paths do match, the authority has to be specified here. This has to match a user's authority. If it doesn't, it will vote to deny. If it goes through this whole list of patterns and doesn't match anything, it will vote to abstain because it says, I'm not sure, I'm not going to deny, and I'm not going to allow, so I'm going to abstain from this vote. In this case, when it hits this value right here, it knows about it and it'll actually abstain. And then what happens is the access decision manager will then have to decide how it's going to handle all those different votes. In this case, we're using the Secure Query Access Decision Manager, and we say allow if all abstain is false, and it is actually a unanimous based voter, which means that everything has to be allow or abstain. And because we have allow if abstains are false, we basically are saying that you have to have at least one of those voters in the unanimous sense. In the unanimous case, you have to have all of those voters vote to allow, and if any abstain, it's not going to count, it's still going to deny. So in this particular case, that's how this voter will actually work. Custom voters, they work the same way. In a custom voter, you can use that metadata source, and you can use something totally different. In the case of the query module dimension value voter, which is used for row level type dimension value authorization, this actually does not use the metadata source. It uses its own thing, but it's passed into it. It could use it if it was coded up that way, but it's not coded to work like that. So that is how the metadata source works. You can have multiple metadata sources, and you can inject them into the various interceptor filters. And the interceptor filter, again, will pass those into the access decision managers, and the access decision managers will make them available to the voters. It's up to the voter on how that voter is coded, whether it's going to use those values or not. I hope that helps, and please feel free to ask any questions, and I look forward to the next security video. Thanks.